Siegfried Sassoon was born on 8 September 1886 in the village of Matfield, Kent, into a family of striking contrasts and creative brilliance. His father, Alfred Ezra Sassoon, was born into the wealthy Baghdadi Jewish merchant dynasty, often dubbed the Rothschilds of the East. Yet, by marrying an Anglo-Catholic woman, Teresa Thornycroft, a celebrated sculptor's daughter, he was disinherited. When Siegfried was just 4, his parents separated. His childhood unfolded in a grand country house called Weirley. Its quiet corridors ironically masked the emotional distance growing between father and son. Educated at New Beacon School and then Marlborough College, Sassoon later matriculated at Clare College, Cambridge, studying history and law. Yeah, it wasn't academia that captured his soul. Instead, he privately published poetry as early as 1906, even producing a humorous parody of John Masefield's The Everlasting Mercy, entitled The Daffodil Murderer. In those years, he lived the leisurely life of a country gentleman, fox, hunting, writing verse, and playing cricket, afforded by a modest inheritance that allowed him to pursue art, unpressured by financial struggle. Then, in 1914, the First World War erupted. Sassoon enrolled the very day Britain declared war on Germany, joining the Sussex Yeomanry, only to suffer a serious riding accident. In May 1915, he received a commission in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and later transferred to the Western Front, where he served with distinction. During a daring raid, he earned the Military Cross in July 1916, and gained the nickname Mad Jack for almost suicidal gallantry. But the detritus of battle, the stench, the mud, the rotting corpses transformed Sassoon's worldview. Where earlier poems had held romantic elegance, now his lyric became dark and bitter, a denunciation of the patriotism that fed the slaughter. Sassoon emerged not just as a medal winner, but as an unmistakably powerful war poet, one whose voice would define trench poetry for generations. By June 1917, wounded in action, Sassoon was recuperating in England and disillusioned. He drafted and delivered his now famous Soldier's Declaration, calling the war prolongation deliberate and implying that soldiers were being sacrificed for political ends. The statement became public, nearly leading to court-martial. Instead, to silence dissent, he was institutionalized at Craiglochart War Hospital, where he met and mentored Wilfred Owen. Sassoon encouraged Owen's writing and helped refine Anthem for Doomed Youth, a partnership that changed literary history. Now, with that context summoned, we shift to 1917, a watershed moment in Sassoon's life. The war, once an adventure or a test of honor, had become tragedy and betrayal. Within the haze of gunfire and disbelief, Sassoon penned a letter destined not for kings or generals, but for posterity. It would later be known as his Soldier's Declaration. But before we read it, we must feel that war, weary pulse, the horror that radicalized him, the moral crisis that compelled a decorated captain to renounce the fight. In this episode, we step into Sassoon's boots. First, we immerse ourselves in his world. A boy born of privilege yet cut by personal loss. A poet whose ink turned red with blood and anxiety. A soldier whose valor became disillusionment. Then we will read his declaration in full, listen to its resonance, and examine how it transformed war poetry and influenced dissent in wartime. Welcome, then, to the trenches of conscience, humanized by Sassoon's story, not just the battlefield, but the broken heart that says, no more.
Siegfried Sassoon, Sreat, Battalion, Royal Welch Fusiliers. I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible to change them without our knowledge, and that, had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be attainable by negotiation. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolonging these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. On behalf of those who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practiced on them. Also, I believe it may help to destroy the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not sufficient imagination to realize. July 1917.
When Siegfried Sassoon submitted his soldier's declaration in July 1917, he knew full well that it was an act of open defiance. In military terms, such a statement accusing those in power of deliberately prolonging the war could be seen as mutiny or even treason. The normal consequence would have been a court-martial, possible imprisonment, and disgrace. Yet Sassoon was not treated as an ordinary soldier. His bravery in combat, his military cross, and his growing reputation as a poet gave him a degree of public sympathy. More importantly, his friend and fellow officer Robert Graves intervened to save him from formal punishment. Graves argued that Sassoon's protest was the result of war neurosis, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Rather than facing trial, Sassoon was sent to Creighton War Hospital in Edinburgh for treatment. Creighton would become a turning point in his life. There, he met Wilfred Owen, then a young and relatively unknown poet. Sassoon recognized Owen's talent immediately and encouraged him to refine his verse, guiding him towards the sharp, realistic style that would later make Anthem for Doomed Youth and Dulce et Decorum Est iconic works of war literature. Their brief friendship was one of the most important mentorships in modern English poetry. Owen would return to the front in 1918 and be killed just days before the armistice, a loss that haunted Sassoon for the rest of his life. Public reaction to the declaration was mixed. Pacifists and war critics praised its courage, while some politicians and military figures condemned it as dangerous propaganda. Newspapers covered it widely, framing Sassoon as both a hero and a traitor, depending on the editorial stance. The British government, already under pressure to maintain public morale, quietly downplayed the controversy by classifying Sassoon's defiance as a medical issue rather than a political one. They avoided turning him into a public martyr. Despite his protest, Sassoon eventually returned to active duty in 1918. His decision remains a subject of debate among historians. Some believe he felt guilty for leaving comrades in the trenches. Others argue he still saw himself as a soldier, despite his opposition to the war's continuation. In the final months of the conflict, he was again wounded, this time by friendly fire. The war ended while he was recovering in England. In the post-war years, Sassoon channeled his wartime experiences into literature. His poetry collections, Counterattack, 1918, War Poems, 1919, and the War Poems of Siegfried Sassoon, 1919, cemented his reputation as one of the leading war poets of his generation. His writing abandoned patriotic idealism in favor of blunt depictions of the front's horrors. He described the mud, the lice, the smell of death stripping away the romantic veneer of battle that earlier poets had maintained. In doing so, he shaped the collective memory of World War I for generations to come. Sassoon's influence extended beyond poetry. In the 1920s and 1930s, he wrote a semi-autobiographical trilogy, Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, 1928, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, 1930, and Schurston's Progress, 1936, blending fiction with his own life story. The books were acclaimed not only for their literary quality, but for their unflinching account of a generation caught in the machinery of war. As the years passed, Sassoon's life moved in new directions. He struggled with his identity, particularly his sexuality, which he could not openly acknowledge in a conservative era. He had relationships with men, including notable figures in the literary world. But in 1933, he married Hester Gatty, with whom he had a son, George. The marriage was troubled, and the couple separated in the 1940s. Sassoon devoted much of his later life to writing prose, including biographies and religious works. In his final decades, Sassoon became increasingly reflective, even spiritual. In 1957, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church, an event that deeply influenced his later poetry. Yet, no matter how far his interests wandered, the shadow of the First World War and his protest against it remained central to his identity. He never regretted writing the Soldier's Declaration, describing it as a moral necessity. Sassoon died on 1 September 1967, just a week shy of his 81st birthday, at his home in Heytesbury, Wiltshire. By then, he had lived through 2 world wars, witnessed the passing of the Edwardian Age into the Atomic Era, and seen his own work become a cornerstone of British literature. The legacy of the Soldier's Declaration is immense. It stands as one of the most direct and uncompromising statements of dissent by a serving officer in modern British military history. Its impact can be traced through multiple channels. In literature, Sassoon's stand and subsequent poetry shifted the tone of war literature from romantic nationalism to realism and moral questioning. Later writers, from Keith Douglas in World War II to modern veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, inherited the idea that it is a soldier's right, even duty, to speak out against unjust wars. In public perception of war, the Declaration contributed to a growing awareness in Britain that the war was not purely a noble cause. It helped break down the idea that dissent in wartime was automatically disloyalty, opening space for political debate, even in moments of national crisis. In military and political history, while the British Army did not change its policies because of Sassoon's protest, his case demonstrated the power of public opinion to influence the treatment of dissenters. It also highlighted the growing role of media in shaping wartime narratives. in the cultural memory of WWI, alongside Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, and Isaac Rosenberg. Sassoon is remembered as a poet who gave voice to the ordinary soldier's suffering. The Soldier's Declaration remains a touchstone in discussions about the ethics of war, military obedience, and the relationship between personal conscience and national duty. Today, more than a century later, Sassoon's protest resonates beyond its historical moment. In every war since 1918, soldiers, journalists, and activists have echoed its themes. The gap between those who fight and those who decide, the moral burden of killing, and the courage it takes to say no when everyone around you says yes. His words continue to be quoted in classrooms, debates, and even courtrooms, not as relics of a bygone war, but as living arguments about the responsibilities of those in uniform. In the end, a soldier's declaration was not merely an act of protest. It was a crystallization of conscience, the point where one man's moral compass outweighed the weight of orders, medals, and patriotic slogans. Sassoon's life after 1917 was long, complex, and often quiet, but that single moment of defiance ensured his place in history. It remains a reminder that, even in the darkest hours, the human voice can rise above the noise of war to speak the truth.
I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cowed and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go.